So, good morning, everybody, here and in cyberspace. Thanks for joining us. We are starting now. We did the intro to Esther a few weeks ago. Sorry about the delay. But we are going to dive in now to the first two chapters of Esther. If you will recall, just a quick recap, that we don't know who the author is, but we suspect he was at least a Jewish sympathizer, probably very well acquainted with Susa and the Persian Empire and customs. We see in the book of Esther as well the same types of themes that we saw in Ruth, of redemption, restoration, and most importantly, God's providence, even though we don't really see God mentioned. And we don't even see prayer mentioned in this book. But God's providence is all over this story. So let's dive in today. What observations did you guys come up with on the first two chapters of our reading?
Women didn't have much say in life.
What did you say, Tina?
Women didn't have much say in their life.
No, they didn't, did they? Tina just made the point that women didn't have much say. And we're going to go into that because this is actually truly fascinating. I did some extra biblical research on the history and culture of the times, especially during the Persian Empire, and it really is quite fascinating. So we'll get into that. Thanks for bringing that up, Tina. Anything else? All right, well, let's dive in. So this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. In some translations, the word is used Ahasuerus. Basically, Ahasuerus, which the translations use, is most likely a title and not his name. Xerxes would be his name. But Ahasuerus means high father or venerable king.
In my translation, it says this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces.
Oh, there you go. It is a title.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's from the New King James Version, Ted. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. I like that translation. And the NASB, it just says Ahasuerus. It doesn't name him as the Ahasuerus. So that's really cool. As we discussed before, 127 provinces. That was huge. And important to note, because it's going to come out in these two chapters, when you've got an empire that big, you've got multiple languages. They've been acquired, they've acquired Babylon, and have annexed so many different provinces with so many different languages. So that's going to play an important role in these first two chapters. Our story begins then when Xerxes is planning his invasion in Greece with a banquet at the citadel. So if you'll recall, I think I mentioned in the intro that you have the city of Susa, but you have a citadel, which is the king's palace, which is separate and above on a hill from the city itself. So we know that he is planning his invasion into Greece basically from a historian who wrote in around 472 BC named Herodotus. Herodotus wrote a book called The Histories, which was basically a history of the Greco-Persian conflict. And so we know from Herodotus that in the first chapter, he's planning his invasion into Greece, and that's why he's assembled all of his princes from the provinces. He's assembled as wise men. He's assembled his wise men as well, and the satraps. So They're clearly planning for 180 days. They're planning this mission and raising money. And in light of the fact that he holds a second banquet that is for everybody in the capital, his planning session and money raising has probably gone quite well. So I thought that was just very interesting. So anyway, he launches his invasion in 479 BC. And we know that he launches the invasion because he is retaliating for the Greeks defeating his father Darius in the Battle of Marathon. So, after 180 days, he's going to display all of his wealth, culminating in yet another banquet that's open to everybody, young and old, in the city. And can you imagine a commoner drinking from a golden goblet? It just kind of blows my mind. And it's in the palace gardens, Susa. So that's very interesting. What we do know also from extra biblical sources is that this citadel actually burned. But Xerxes had already built a second palace in Persepolis. But he's not there yet. He's still living, obviously, here in Susa. His son, Artaxerxes, will move into the Persepolis palace later. White and violet were the royal colors of Persia. There are 7 days of feasting and drinking to one's heart's content. Typically, during such celebrations as that, every time the king drank, you had to drink. And Xerxes waives that and just says, drink whatever you want. So I thought that was very interesting. Meanwhile, Vashti's having her own banquet for the women in the palace. And that's not uncommon. So this is where we're going to get into what you were bringing up, Tina. I did a little research on the women of ancient Persia. So you know now, most of them are wearing burqas. They are very oppressed. It's not a good place to be a woman in this area today. And some of it comes from this era. Some of it does not. Because in ancient Persia, the women of those times actually had a lot of freedom. They could own businesses. They could be in the military. They could be independent. They could choose not to marry. They had actually quite a lot of freedom. The weird thing, though, that they could not do, and all those things were open to both royal women and commoners. So it's very important. The interesting thing, though, is that if they were royal, there was a law, and Ted and I saw evidence of it in India, that women, wives in particular, royal wives, could not be seen by anybody else except the husband. So the wife could listen in on every planning meeting, strategy, anything with the king's councilman, all of that. But she listened through a window slit that was about this wide and about that tall.
The Wind Palace.
Exactly. That's what I was going to bring up, Ted. Good point. So in India, Ted and I visited several places, actually. One was the Wind Palace. And if you go there now, it's called the Wind Palace because they have all of these little windows that are slits like this. And it was for the royal women and her ladies in waiting, for lack of a better term, to sit and watch all of the parades, see the military marching down the street, but they could not be seen. And we saw it in the palaces in Udaipur and Jaipur too. You would have the king's court where he would conduct his meetings, and the court would be surrounded by those little slits of windows. so the royal women could listen in on everything, but they could not be seen. So kind of a really weird dichotomy. I can't even imagine being a woman during that time, having that kind of liberality with that kind of oppression as well. It's very different. They could even have, as a matter of fact, they could even have the same jobs as men had. I thought that was very interesting. So, on the final day of the feast, clearly all the men are quite inebriated, and the king summons Vashti to come and display her royal beauty before everyone present. So now we see that he's defying the law.
Mm-hmm.
He's asking her to come and present herself. Some commentators will say, pardon me, that he asked her to come in nothing but her crown, completely naked. That's in some rabbinic literature. Other rabbinic literature says that, well, no, Gabriel had stricken her with leprosy, or that she was pregnant with Artaxerxes, so she didn't want to show. Whether it was that, or whether it was because she's stuck in a rock in a hard place. Do I obey the king, or do I disobey, or do I obey the law? She has to make a choice, and she says, you know what? No. I wouldn't really necessarily want to go and parade myself in front of a bunch of drunk men either. But anyway, at any rate, she refuses. And so, and Vashti, by the way, means best, beloved, and desired one. Vashti, although she's not really listed by that name in any extra biblical literature, she could be a mistress who was the father of Artaxerxes. We just don't know. It could be a Greek name versus a Persian name. We just don't know. So given the rights women did have, as well as the inebriated state and the law, it is no wonder Vashti refused the king's command. The king becomes angry, and I love the way that is such an understatement.
Mm-hmm.
Because Xerxes wasn't just angry. Xerxes is, if you look at the psychology manuals of today, you would say the guy was absolute manic depressive. He was noted in extra biblical sources of being incredibly volatile and completely unpredictable. So he's not a nice guy. For instance, this first one is kind of funny. He had a bridge built over Hellesport, but it got destroyed in a storm, right? So he orders his men to flog the sea for 300 strokes as retaliation. And then he beheads all the builders of the bridge. Another story, he had a man in his court who was extremely wealthy by the name of Pythias. And Pythias sent a huge monetary gift to Xerxes for his military campaigns. And it was such a large sum that Xerxes sent it back to him and said, "Thank you ever so much, but I can't accept this." And then only later, Pythias sends a note to Xerxes saying, "I am now old, feeble, sick, and I need one of my sons to help me. Can you spare one of my sons from your military?" Xerxes says, "No. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take your son, I'm going to cut him in two, and we're going to have our military men walk between the pieces." So, I mean, this guy is not a nice man by any means. So, and I would call him mad. I just basically call him a mad king. Yes.
In verse 18, where it says that the king would show excessive contempt, the Hebrew on that is only used in this book at this time, and it translates literally as despise.
Is what?
Despise.
Yeah. Exactly. The disrespect and discord. Yeah, exactly. And that's Memucan talking about what he thinks that should happen. So I find that becomes really amusing. So he calls on his wise men. How wise do you think these men really actually are? So they're going, oh my gosh, we're going to have a liberations movement, a women's liberation movement. We must shut it down. So they respond in fear, right? For the women getting uppity. So they decide to issue an edict stating that all women are to give honor to their husbands, that they would be the men would be the master of his own house, and the one who speaks the language of his own people. So, as I mentioned before, we've got tons of different languages in this Persian Empire. And naturally, I mean, it just makes sense. The kids are going to adopt the mother's language because the mother is the one who's raising the kids. What he's saying here is, no, mother needs to learn husband's language and speak that to the children. So, that's pretty obnoxious. But they are just so afraid that they're going to lose control of their women that they have to issue this edict. And the way it goes out, and this is very interesting too, how would you think that they would send letters out to this vast, vast empire? It's a precursor to the Pony Express.
By courier.
Yeah, exactly. By courier, Tina says. They would have a horse and rider who would ride for a day, pass the edict off to the next horse and rider, and that one would ride for a day, and it just went out to all the provinces that way. So, nothing new under the sun.
Don't get there by 10 a.m., whatever day it may be.
That's right. Rain, sleet, or snow. After these things, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided. Now, that's not very clear. That starts with chapter 2. What has happened here? Because we're going to find out in verse 16 that Esther is made queen in the 7th year of his reign. So he has suffered defeat at the invasion with Greece. So our little mad king is having a pity party, right? So he's going, oh my gosh, I feel so well by Vashti. And he, so much so that he's inconsolable. And his eunuchs are going, oh golly, what are we going to do with this mad king? So they decide that they should find a new wife for Xerxes to replace Vashti. Keep in mind, although, while they're looking for somebody to replace Vashti, he does have 300 concubines waiting for him in his harem. It's not like he's without. But it's just not good enough. So, that idea pleased Xerxes, and so they send people out looking for women to replace Vashti. And that's when Mordecai and Esther enter our story finally. What I think is interesting here is they give Mordecai's Babylonian name, and it is actually son of Marduk, which Marduk was a Persian god, a Babylonian god. So, but they don't give him his Jewish name. They do that with Esther. They give both her Jewish name and her Babylonian name. But let's talk about Mordecai's lineage. He's the son of Jair, the son of Shimei. This is what we learn here in Esther. The son of Kish, a Benjamite. Well, that's significant because Kish was the father of King Saul. And the author might be referring back to an old feud when he introduces Haman into the story. King Saul was ordered by God to go and destroy the Amalekites and take no prisoners, take nothing from them. Saul said, well, I'm going to leave Agag alive, and I'm going to take spoils. Those were totally against God's plans. Well, Haman is an Agagite. So after Saul's disobedience to God, Samuel is the one who goes and basically chops Agag into pieces. So there's a standing feud, obviously, between King Saul and the Amalekites or Agagites. And oh, wow, we have Mordecai, who's a descendant of Saul. So there's that feud that's just pretty much ongoing anyway. That might come into play. So, and Mordecai and Esther, the king of Judah at the time of the Babylonian captivity, Jeconiah was the king, and he was taken first into Babylonian captivity. And the fact that they went into the fact that Mordecai and Esther went into captivity with Jeconiah probably means that they were of either royal blood or were quite wealthy themselves. So they were among the first captives into Babylon. What's in a name? Esther's Babylonian name means star. Her Jewish name, they tell us, is Hadassah. We just met a Hadassah this week. Hi, Hadassah, if you're watching.
Yes, we did.
It means myrtle, and it's a symbol of prosperity, success, and eternity of life, and it ultimately becomes a symbol of the Jewish nation also, which I think is kind of cool. And the flower of the myrtle tree is star-shaped. So,
I did not know that.
yeah, so that's how she probably came by Esther as her Babylonian name. And clearly she's quite beautiful, as was Vashti. So, but again, I said, I think it's interesting that they give Esther both of her names. That to me is a clear signal that this is a woman with two different identities. And two different identities that are going to come into play in a big way.
Straddling fences is hard.
Exactly. Just said straddling fences is hard. And she, in fact, has to do that in a big way. So she is taken into the king's palace, into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. We can assume that Mordecai had no choice but to relinquish her to the palace with that decree. Some say he should have come out then as Jewish. He probably could have. I don't know what that would have done, but it's not what he chose to do. And I don't know about you guys. Tell me if you feel the same way. I kind of don't like Mordecai at this point because he could have saved his cousin from being taken into the king's palace and basically violated. And he did nothing to do that.
It was in his best interest.
Well, right. Ted's making the point, is it in his best interest? And that's the big question. But we saw, compare him to Joseph. Joseph went into Egypt and he made no bones about who he was and what he stood for. And when he was almost raped by the queen, he took off running, and he ended up in jail for it. So Mordecai certainly isn't like Joseph, would you say? I mean, what do you guys think? Do you think Mordecai is wrong for not speaking up about his Jewish heritage?
We wouldn't have a story if he didn't.
Tina, good point. We wouldn't have a story if he had.
Well, he also had a place to go. I mean, he could have gone back to
Exactly.
Jerusalem.
Yeah, and Ted's making that point that I was going to bring up. He should have been going back to Jerusalem. That's what God called him to do. And yet he stayed in Susa. And we've already discussed, Jerusalem was Backwattersville. They probably would not have looked for a replacement for Vashti in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Most likely. I mean, that's pure supposition on my part. But, yeah, so it's interesting to think about that on Mordecai. Now, he will have a total redemption and I will love him more. But right now I'm just kind of going, that was really wrong, man. So she gets taken in, and several of the commentaries on verse 9, let's see, where is verse 9? She pleased him and won his favor. They're talking about Esther with the eunuch, with Haggai. And so many commentators will say, she charmed Haggai.
I hate that.
I do too.
I
Thank
hate
you.
that. It doesn't say that.
No.
That's not the text.
No, it doesn't say that. And that to me sounds manipulative. It sounds like, I don't know, it's condescending in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even like the translation, and she won his favor. That's not the direct translation. It actually should read, let me find it. It has the meaning of receiving or obtaining, rather than doing something to manipulate the result of achieving favor.
Obtained would be earned.
Exactly.
And that's the Hebrew is obtained.
Exactly. So here's my thought. I don't think that a Jewess who is so obedient to her cousin Mordecai would go in there batting her eyelashes. Have any of you known gorgeously stunning women who were absolute shrews? I have.
Well,
Yeah.
it always seemed to me that when I've read Esther and commentaries and whatnot, is she was obedient to Mordecai.
Mm-hmm.
She was brought up very respectful of her elders.
Exactly.
And so to me, when she went in there, she made herself underneath Haggai. I mean, she saw that she was a humble gal, which
Yeah.
She was sincere. She was
Very-
just as she was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank
that's
you,
the way
Marcy.
I read it.
Thank you. That's the way I have always read it too, and I get really frustrated with commentators who say, "Oh, she was just beauty, and she won them with her beauty."
Well, that's very patriarchal, way of thinking. And isn't it all the truth that when you meet? I'm thinking of Cynthia. When you get a chance to sit down, Cynthia is Phil's wife. We
In
stayed
Texas.
with them in Texas, and she's a beautiful, beautiful lady. She's also humble as they come.
She is.
Yeah.
And that enhances, her character enhances everything else.
Her beauty.
Exactly.
It does.
Exactly. Thank you, Marcy. Marcy made the point that she's always read it as the way that Esther is brought up. She's brought up being obedient and humble and kind and respectful. And that's what I wanted everybody to pull out of this as well. It's not her beauty that wins Haggai's favor.
He's a eunuch.
He's a
He's a
eunuch.
eunuch.
Exactly. She's respectful. I'm going to say, if you've got a eunuch who is controlled by some very powerful men, what's going to appeal to him isn't beauty. It's going to be somebody respects me and thinks highly of my opinions. So that's what I thank you, Marcy. That's what I was hoping you guys would pull out of this. I mean, look at, we can look at Vashti. Vashti was gorgeous. Look what it got her. Not a whole lot. So I think Esther has so much more going on for her than just being beautiful.
Well, the other thing that we haven't quite gotten there yet, but these were all beautiful women.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Why would the king choose Esther?
Yeah,
She had something in her character
exactly.
that is not, that's beyond the physical beauty
Exactly.
that appealed to him, even if he is mad.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So what made her different? What set her apart? Now, of course,
Mhm.
God could do anything and everything, but
Right, right.
she just had a character that was,
Yes,
was
it's
very humble.
appealing and humbling, and yeah, I agree with you, Marcy. Marcy made the point that later when Esther wins favor with the king, not wins favor, obtains favor from the king, it is because there's something about her character. Yes, God's providence is at hand here, and he is working it out, but Esther has a particular appeal because of her respect, her kindness, all of that. I agree with you, Marcy, completely. So, she's given food. You think it was kosher?
Good point.
Probably not.
Because she was not allowed to reveal her
She
origins.
was not allowed to reveal her origins, so and the girls gotta eat. So most likely the food wasn't kosher. Isn't that funny? Yeah. And I can't help but wonder, and we'll get into this in the interpretation section, but how awkward it must have been on the first meal. Did it get easier with each one?
Tends to.
Yeah. And how does that affect later her willingly going into the king? I mean, well, we'll save that for interpretation. Just keep that in the back of your mind, though. She undergoes a year of beauty treatments. Sounds pretty nice, but I have a hard time even getting to a beauty salon. So to get my hair cut my own hair. Esther only takes in with her to the king what Haggai suggests. And again, Marcy, I think that that's drawing upon her kindness. She is showing respect to Haggai. All the other women are probably ordering Haggai around going, get me this, get me that. And she's going, what do you think I should take in? You know she's got to be nervous.
And humble.
And humble. She's got to be afraid and respectful. So all of those things kind of play into that. I think she's just a woman of great character. So naturally she obtains the king's favor. But also noteworthy, she slept with a pagan king and out of wedlock. That had to have been hard. No matter how many steps you've taken into going against God's law, that's got to be hard. She doesn't simply find favor, she finds kindness with the king. And I think that says a lot. Given that we're talking about a mad king, there's something in her that settles him down. And that is not just a woman who's kind and gentle. That is a strong woman who can subdue a mad, bipolar king. That's pretty impressive.
It shows a lot of wisdom
It does,
to be able to,
to do that.
yeah.
Ted says that shows a lot of wisdom, and he's spot on. And interestingly, where it says that she gains his kindness, guess what that goes back to? It's the kindness that we find in Ruth. It's covenantal love from a mad king. That's pretty incredible. that speaks volumes of Esther's character, and it speaks volumes of God's providence. That she could win covenantal love from a mad king. That's pretty cool. So those are the observations that we have. What interpretations did you draw out of the text this week? Ted?
It's better to be in obedience, but even in disobedience, God can use you.
Exactly. Ted just made the point that it's better to be in obedience to God, but even if you're in disobedience, God can still use you.
His plan will be done.
Yep, his plan is never going to be thwarted. In the beginning, with the king giving several lavish banquets, commoners drinking out of golden goblets, what do you think this says of our king and his ego? We've already discussed that. But to say further, the beginning of our story is fraught with drunken revelry, bad decisions, tender egos, wastefulness and arrogance. In short, it's corrupt. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. How wise do you think these men actually are? His councilmen. Very wise.
Well, there are two buy-offs going on too. The noblemen who are coming to the parties are paying him, and they're paying him for recognition, but then the king is turning around and buying the recognition of the commoners.
Exactly. That's a good point. Ted's making the point that the king is buying them off, but and by his, how did you say it, Ted? Repeat it.
There are two buy-offs. The noblemen are coming to buy favor from the king, giving gifts,
right.
But the king is turning around and buying the favor of the commoners.
Yes, so the commoners are buying from the king, and the king is buying from the commoners. Yeah, agreed. Everybody wants favor. Do you think that the council's edicts won the women's hearts far and wide? I like how Frederick W. Bush said it. The king who rules the whole world effectively, its biggest empire up to date, cannot bend his own wife to his will, but is the first chapter's mockery but its mockery has also a sinister side. It reveals a society fraught with danger, for it is ruled by pride and pomposity of buffoons with tender egos who can marshal the state's legislative and administrative machinery for the furtherance of selfish and childish causes. I was like, that is a really damning kind of...
What is he really like?
Yeah. But it is kind of scary to think about. You know, they get afraid of a women's liberation movement, and they can move the entire government to do what they want as a result. But who do you think is working behind the scenes here when as yet there is no threat to the Jews? Yep, Ted said it. God. It's a mystery to me how God works his providence while allowing men their free will. But clearly, he is working on behalf of the Jews to later save them from, quite frankly, the outcomes of Mordecai's and Esther's disobedience. And, you know, we already talked about them being in Susa when they should have been in Jerusalem. But I think you can actually make the argument, as much as we appreciate Esther's kindness, her respectfulness, her obedience, as far as a Jewess goes, she's probably nominal at best. Because she and Mordecai could have behaved as Joseph did, and yet they didn't. it was just easy to just let her go, let her eat non-kosher food, let her sleep with a Gentile king out of wedlock.
Did he really have did he really have a choice?
Well, he could have.
He needed to be gone before this edict came out of bring me the beautiful women.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Tina. Tina's making the point, did he really have a choice? I think that given how long they had been in Susa and how long these types of things had gone on, I think he chose the easiest route, which is to just hand her over. But I also think, and probably if he had defied the edict, they would have killed him right then.
Right.
So you're right, Tina, and I agree with that.
But, the choice needed to be made before the edict came out, but you didn't know the edict was coming out, so
Right.
you make the choice.
So you didn't have, exactly. She's making the point that they could have gone back before the edict came out, and they didn't. So then they were left without a choice.
But then we can compare him also to the other Joseph, Mary's husband,
Mm-hmm.
who defied an edict and fled to Egypt.
Yeah.
They could have.
You're
they
very
probably could
right,
have fled.
Ted. Yeah, they probably could have fled to Jerusalem. Who knows whether they would have pursued them or not.
Yeah.
But you're right, Ted. Ted's making the point that he could have made the decision like Joseph, of Mary and Joseph did, and fled to Egypt when the edict came out, but they did not do that. It's all a lot of what ifs, and as you made the point, Tina, we wouldn't have a story if they had said no. Which I think then solidifies the very point that you brought up at the very beginning. Whether you're in obedience or whether you are in disobedience, God will use you. And God's will is not going to be thwarted. So, what do you think about Esther having the two identities? Any thoughts on that? Was just curious because that struck me as wow. Interesting. She's the only one who's given both names. I don't know if it's because she is a woman of two identities. I don't know if it's because the writer wanted to appeal to both Persians, Babylonians, and Jews. Could be. Any other thoughts? No?
Well, yeah. The two identities shows very, very clearly that she and Mordecai had integrated significantly into the Persian culture.
Right.
I can't say this as a fact, but it seems very clear to me that they really had no intention of going back. They had it good in Persia.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ted. Ted's making the point that they had really, sort of like Elimelech and Naomi, they had kind of assimilated into the culture of the Moabites. And here we have a similar situation. Mordecai and Esther have probably very much assimilated into the Persian Empire. And if he came in as royalty or wealthy, they're sitting pretty well in the capital of Susa and probably have no intentions of going back to Jerusalem. And so I think, as we keep making the point, these are just ordinary people who sometimes make bad decisions and who God never removes his hand from. And that's pretty awesome. And I already made the point with Esther. Do you think it gets easier with each non-kosher meal? How easily we can do something that maybe isn't something that we would perceive as sin, And yet we do something else because that was so easy to do, that suddenly you're moving into an area of sin in your life. Ted?
Okay, I'm just going back to our Global Missions Fellowship days when I took over as CFO, and I found within months a 7-figure fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my predecessor had borrowed money from the missionary support account, $50,000 to pay for overhead, and with all intentions of repaying it.
Right.
Well, then nobody noticed, and 7 months later, couldn't make the overhead payments again. He borrowed another $50,000. Well, after 10 years, it's 7 figures.
Yeah.
You know, and the intent was always to repay.
Well, yeah, the intent is always to repay. That was exactly what was coming to mind, that story, when I was thinking about Esther eating kosher food, of how easily we can justify the ends with our means. It's a huge warning sign. So, and I think she is so dependent on Haggai, because I think she finally, after a year of being pampered and after a year of eating kosher food and all that, non-kosher food, sorry, that she's suddenly faced with the penultimate of her and Mordecai's decision of having to go in to a king who probably has a reputation for being mad, a Gentile king at that, and she's not married. I can't imagine how that must have felt for her. And so she just totally depends on Haggai. So we'll move on to applications. And you guys, I know I never ask you to share your applications because they can be very personal. But I am more than willing to share mine because I think we learn from each other. Ted?
I've got one I'm willing to share,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the need for individual accountability.
Oh, that's good.
I mean, you know, if you're just going to be a free-range believer, there's no accountability there.
That is
And we
right.
need each other to lovingly redirect us back to the proper path.
Mm-hmm. We do. Ted's making a very, very good point. We can't be free-range believers. We need accountability. That's why we are a community. We are a fellowship of believers, because iron sharpens iron. When we fall astray, I hope, expect, and anticipate that somebody needs to set me straight. We did that just with, I was telling Charlotte yesterday that at lunch.
Charlotte didn't do anything wrong.
No. But Charlotte brought us back into the church when I had been so burned by churches in the past that I didn't want to step foot in one. And she got us back into this church, and I was so thankful to her yesterday for that, because she got our hands back on the plow.
Yeah.
And that's important. We need each other. That is rich, Ted. Thank you. As we have seen throughout history, monarchies and empires will always have their strongholds of corruption. We saw it with Watergate. We saw it with the Clinton scandal. And it's going on today in spades. Oh my gosh. We see corruption in businesses and corporations. You've got Enron. You've got Countrywide in 2008. You've got Lehman Brothers in 2008. Sadly, we've seen and continue to see corruption in mission boards and churches that have made illegal decisions and decisions of financial malfeasance, all in the belief that the ends justify the means. Or even more subtle reason of convincing themselves that it's just one tiny little act, that's what we were talking about, Ted, that no one will notice and that will soon be corrected. However, like Xerxes and frankly like Esther, one little act leads to another and the hole gets deeper and deeper. So the big question, what areas of my life need some prayerful correction and adjustment?
I think this is one of those things where it is so important. We skip over this verse and it's misapplied. It's significantly misapplied in the Catholic Church. But the confess your sins one to another.
Mm-hmm.
How often do we really do that?
Yeah.
I mean, most of my reminders of God are frankly my very
Your
publicly
confessions,
confessing my
yeah.
sins and
Mm-hmm.
learn from my screw up, you know.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. I think that's
but
very
how often
right.
do we really confess our sins one to another?
Yeah, and I would add to that, have we as a church faltered in, and I'm not talking about the big C church, I'm talking about small churches and fellowships of believers. Have we faltered in being a haven where people feel like they can come and confess their sins and find forgiveness and find acceptance? And yeah, Marcy's shaking her head. That's it. It's not. We are no longer.
We're not a haven.
We're not a haven, and we should be. We should be about sharing the love of Christ.
And Marcy, I appreciate that because in my mind, after 35 years of being a pastor, the church should be the safest place in the world when somebody says, "How are you doing today?" for you to be able to say, "I really had too much to drink yesterday and it was really hard for me to come."
Mm-hmm.
Should be the safest place in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. So that's a huge lesson for us all, not just to confess our sins to one another, but to be kind and gracious in those who we are fellowshipping with.
I'm going to tell on you, and this is really, really funny. We were having a edification time among the pastoral staff and their spouses, you know, saying what we really appreciate about what this person did. And one person said about Glenda, "Every Sunday you ask me how I'm doing, and then you stop in front of me like you really expect me to tell you." It's like, yeah, she does that.
Yeah, that says a lot. Thank you. Thank you. How often does my selfishness get in the way of serving others, of loving my husband? How often do we all tell little white lies so as to not incriminate ourselves? How often do we justify our poor decisions in order to save face? How often are we afraid to admit that we might be wrong in any given situation? And this is true confession time. My parents were awful at teaching my brothers and I how to apologize and how to seek forgiveness. Tina's laughing. I can't be the only one in the room. I love that. They saw apologies as a sign of weakness rather than a strength of character. And asking for an apology is strength of character.
I think too, one of the things I've started doing is I'm sending prayers to the elder board at SWBC on their elder meetings. And one of my prayers for them today was that everybody listen in order to learn and understand instead of listening in order to reply.
Oh, that's good. Yes.
Because so often
That
we
is so
listen
true.
to reply.
Yeah, that is so true. Ted's making the point that oftentimes when we're listening, we're already forming the answer or the reply in our heads instead of truly listening to understand. And that's a huge one. I have seen it as recently as this week, the way people will fight back to defend themselves, whether they're right or wrong, when called out on their behavior. And yes, these are Christians.
Yes, I've heard this week, but I've always done it this way.
We aren't we're saved. We aren't immune to sinful behavior. And corruption can creep in at any time. That's why I think, Ted, you're spot on. We need accountability partners who can hold our feet to the fire. So that was one application. Wasn't that a fun one? It's interesting in Esther's story, though, how we already see God working behind the scenes to bring about his will of saving his chosen nation. And we all know how Esther's story ends. It has a happily ever after. Love that. Here's the thing, though. What happens when we don't know how the story ends? Because that's the way we live our lives. We have no idea how our story ends. Yes, ultimately, God is and will be victorious in the overarching story of the world's history. But what about day-to-day stories? Think about Vashti. She obeyed the law rather than her husband. Was she wrong? She was placed in a no-win situation. Look what it got her. Think of Esther. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being taken into the harem of a mad king because he was having a pity party. Sometimes we must suffer the consequences of our own poor decisions. Worse still, and this one was tough. This one just hit me really hard. Sometimes we suffer the consequences of someone else's poor decisions. Right? And we just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tina, you nailed it. I see you going, those times when bad things happen to good people, it happens. I know they've happened to me. I'm sure they've happened to you. How did those times make you feel? I can tell you from experience, it hurts most when it comes from someone you least expect. A loved one, a devout believer, a church.
You can only be betrayed by a friend.
Yeah, exactly. Ted makes the point. You can only be betrayed by a friend. Did you feel violated? Did you feel betrayed, alone, ostracized, outcast? How about hopeless, angry, hurt, disappointed? And do I dare say, feeling like your faith is shaken? Because I've been there. You ask God why, because you simply can't see a good reason for the suffering you're going through.
That's why it's the Christian faith and not the Christian no.
Exactly. Ted makes the point, that's why it's the Christian faith and not the Christian no. What should be our immediate response when we are betrayed like that? I think we should fall on our knees in prayer. God can take all those bad feelings. He can listen to you rant and rage. And do you know what his response is going to be every single time? Exactly. I love you. While it feels like a lot of silence that's coming at you, please understand that's Satan's lie. The enemy wants you wallowing in those feelings, whittling away at your faith. But the truth is, his answer is always, don't worry, I got you. Ted?
Read the Psalms. You see David pouring out his heart of the disappointments that he faces time after time after time, and his guilt.
Yeah. Ted's saying spend some time in the Psalms. I had a friend today send me a psalm of encouragement when I asked her for prayer over Ted's leg. The Psalms are a source of comfort. They really are. So God says, don't worry, I got you. Trust me and lean not on your own understanding. This is God's faith-building answer rather than a faith-diminishing one.
Well said.
So That's all I have for today. Ted, would you close us in prayer?
Absolutely. Heavenly Father, wow, thank you for your word. And thank you for how you have gifted Glenda so much as such a great teacher. Thank you for the clarity that she brought to some two very difficult chapters. Father, thank you for this fellowship that we enjoy together today. We pray, Father, that we leave this room as different people than we were when we came. May your Spirit fill us to overflowing, and may we exemplify the fruit of your Spirit. It's in Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Thank you.